Enough a break for you?
Yes, sir.
All right. Well, correct me if I'm wrong. I believe we said we were going to talk about law enforcement stuff, but maybe crowd control and stuff specifically. Is that right?
Yeah, I think so. Just in that space. Yep. Yep.
All right. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start kind of high level. We have some people that have some law enforcement background in this group, so I'm going to start high level, and I'm not talking down to anybody or acting as if people don't understand this. We don't have any of our New Jersey friends that the only state or one of the few states that the IMT people are all law enforcement, which is very unusual. Most of the time, you have to try to help the law enforcement spell ICS in some places. That's the way it was at my agency. I did 24 years. So my background was law enforcement before I got into emergency management and before I got on, or as I got onto the IMTs. So I've kind of been there, done that. I did teach. It was one of the first topics I taught 26 years ago. I started was riot control. And where that came from was I had previously, or I had been at the time in the Virginia National Guard. And when I was in the National Guard, joined when I was 17, we did riot control as one of our primary missions, our primary state mission, if you will. National Guard has a national mission and a state mission. Our national mission, we were infantry soldiers. Deployable for the state mission primarily we were riot control, and then also we could do some wildland fire stuff, which we really didn't get training in, but I think they'd have done it just in time. So when I was in the National Guard, I always thought, man, we don't really know what we're doing. The cops really know what they're doing. We would train a full weekend, so a full, I don't know, say 12-hour days. You'd get a good 30 hours of training in a weekend. On riot training every year. So 30 hours per year. But I always thought, man, the cops really know how to do this stuff. And when I joined the police department, went through the academy, I got my awesome 4-hour class on riot control. And I was like, holy moly, they really don't know what they're doing as much. Law enforcement doesn't. So, and that was at my agency at that time. That's the only thing we received was a 4-hour class in the academy, no in service. So I saw that as a need, ended up pushing it forward. And a few years later, we started doing training for the whole department in the year 2000. We had a lieutenant that was he just saw civil disturbance being issues in the future. So we trained the whole department. And then in subsequent years, 2002, 2003, 2004, we ended up partnering with the National Guard and our fire department, and we traveled to Fort Pickett to a base where they had a Mount City, and we did joint operations or joint training with the National Guard, law enforcement, fire departments, et cetera. We were using our mounted patrol, our horses, we had dogs, we had chemical weapons, we did all kind of stuff. It was great, and a lot of things were learned through that. So that's where I'm gonna slow down, back up, and talk about law enforcement aspects when, as a planning section chief on a Type 3 team, coming into all hazard world, you can get that mixed box of chocolate of anything, and you might roll in and be assisting a locality with some type of law enforcement event. That could be a manhunt, that could be a civil disturbance, it could be several different things. We'll kind of concentrate on civil disturbance stuff, but there are other aspects as well. Backing up, first and foremost, because of the culture of law enforcement, these are people that routinely they drive around in their car, usually one person to a car in most places in the United States, some places in some urban areas, maybe two, and all day long during their shift, they may get dispatched to calls, but they determine how they're driving to that call, what route they're taking to that call, how they're approaching that call, what actions they're going to take on that call. They're basically they're not supervised, if you will. Nobody is over them supervising them. They're a complete independent operator. They're making all their own decisions all day long. Then you have some type of incident where you have to throw a bunch of law enforcement together and they're required to work as a team. That becomes a problem. You now threw a bunch of independent thinkers together that they're not used to working as a squad, as a platoon, as a team. They're used to working as an individual doing their own thing. You start running into some problems. So it's a culture thing, if you will. Most of the time, the fire service in the city that I worked in, a simple house fire was kind of the main call, if you will. For them, they would throw, I don't know, I think it was about 15 firefighters at that type of call, and in about 4 or 5 different pieces of apparatus, right? So they routinely worked as a team. So for the fire service, it's just a culturally, they're used to being divided into divisions or groups, if you will, and functioning that way with a supervisor. Law enforcement many times is not. So unless they have trained on this a lot, it becomes somewhat of a struggle, um, if you will. So again, big picture, working with law enforcement. So you're going into this entity, whatever the situation is, and you're trying to assist as a planning section chief. It does help to have a little bit of that. Keep that in the back of your mind, if you will. Those basics of like they're not really used to this. It's different, and sometimes you have to do a lot of just-in-time training, trying to ICS it, if you will. And I always mention on our team, we're in the western part of the state, and ICS is sometimes difficult to spell for some jurisdictions, not just the law enforcement, but others in it. We have to be our IMT. We have to kind of be baby steps almost as you come in. It's very difficult to come in and slap down the planning P or throw it up on a wall and go, this is what we're doing right here. We're now in the STEM and we're going to be going through here and we need to set a strategy meeting, and then we're going to do a tactics meeting, and then we're going to do a planning meeting. A lot of times we have to kind of meet them halfway, and I'll just say a meeting. I won't even call it what it is, but we'll just kind of say, all right, we need to have a meeting and start working on this, and we'll get them baby steps towards the right direction, if that makes sense. And then it's baby steps of getting them towards the right direction and emphasize them very cautiously. It does help for me as a planning section chief that has law enforcement background to work with a law enforcement agency. I have that credibility, if you will. I hope that makes sense to everybody. When you come in from a different discipline, you come in from fire service or maybe environmental health and safety aspect or something, and you're a planning chief, you sometimes don't always have the credit. So within your teams, if you have people with law enforcement background, maybe they're not a planning section chief, but maybe they can be pulled into almost liaison to planning, if that makes sense, with the entity. As far as the planning role, when because planning, you are the keeper of the process, you are the keeper of the plan. You're trying to maintain those standards, those ICS standards, those basic concepts, and it can be a struggle at times with different entities. And so if you've got somebody that can liaison, bring them over. Maybe they're routinely a logistics person, but they got a LE background. Bring them over maybe as I know that's not a position, and I know I'm probably committing heresy, but a planning liaison, if you will, between the jurisdiction and yourself, so that you can try to get them the right direction. Let me start talking about some civil disturbance stuff, along with the law enforcement as far as planning. The National Guard. I know some of you have done the wildfire stuff, so you've probably worked with the National Guard on that. Who has anybody speak up, raise your hand, do something if you've worked with National Guard assets on wildfires? Somebody has, I know.
Yep. Yeah.
So tell me a little bit. Just tell me a little bit about that. Tell me a little bit about that. How that went. Any difficulties? Anything else?
Yeah, for sure. A lot of ours out here has been medevac or aviation support. Just happens to be our local guard unit. Our state guard unit is an aeromedical evac squadron. And so we've got the helicopters, and we also have the C-130s that they put the MAFs unit into. Okay. And so kind of a limited role, not the boots on the ground necessarily. But it's been bumpy each time, trying to figure out who's on which status and who's paying for what, and rules of engagement and all that sort of deal. We've landed, but it's been bumpy.
Okay. So requesting them, what is the process for, like, you need X asset that belongs to the National Guard to do Y? How do you get that to take place?
Yeah, we have kind of a unique perspective here because I haven't worked for state emergency management, and so that kind of trickles up through the local IC to the local EOC, ultimately ends in our office, and we're working with the governor's office and then the Joint Operations Center at the Guard to kind of tie out and say, hey, can Guard fill this? they have the right capabilities, tools, equipment, etc. And then governor, are you good with us, utilizing these folks? And so it takes a minute. One of our guard generals summarized it that we're slow, but at least we're expensive. So,
So when I talked about those big joint trainings we did at Fort Pickett, when you get all the way down into the weeds to the actual tactics on the ground, we found out several things in working with them. One is they will not take direct orders from law enforcement on the ground. In other words, we were in a tactical situation. We're in the city there, if you will. There's rioters out front. They move. Okay, the rioters kind of move down the street, and the law enforcement officer there behind the line looks at the young lieutenant from the National Guard and's like, "Take your guys and move up right there. Go to that next corner. Let's take it." And what would have to happen on their end is that lieutenant would have to radio up to his commander, and then his commander would have to evaluate that and then radio back down to that guy. And then after all that took place, the rioters were all back in the street and they couldn't move up to, because now it's been taken back. So it's like you said, it takes a minute. There is a very slow process. They don't take direct, they're not put like under your control directly when you're doing the riot control or civil disturbance stuff. It takes, and so the way that it worked with us is we had to learn, you have to deal with it takes a minute aspect. So what you have to do as far as like a planning aspect, you got to think about this, you've got to plan in all that extra time. So they learned that, all right, now if we're going to do some type of tactical move, we need these troops to move up to this area, or we need them to take this objective, or we need them to do whatever it doesn't matter, we need them to complete some type of task. We need to plan that well in advance. We've got to get all the clearances and everything ahead of time so that when the time comes, we can then move, because it does take a minute. That was the best way to describe it, Spencer. So working with them, we found out that stuff. They don't. When you get into civil disturbance, they're not making arrests. They're relying on the local law enforcement to make those arrests. They have to have a very specific mission. They've got very specific rules of engagement. In one of the other scenarios we did with them, one of the training scenarios, it was almost comical. They are a National Guard soldier. I was one of them. I was an infantry soldier, right? So I'll say we, because I was that. They are the best trained dogs in the world. Like, you'll tell them, hold this corner, they will hold that corner until they die. Okay, but they're just not allowed to think outside of the box. So they're completely the opposite of what I was talking about with law enforcement, where law enforcement, independent thinkers, they can just make decisions on the fly. Those soldiers are under the command of a squad leader or a platoon leader, and they only do what they are told. So in this scenario, we had a scenario where National Guard was in a part. We were at an old school. It was like a campus style school. And so we had free run of everything. They were going to tear it down. So we got to break stuff. It was awesome. So this National Guard platoon is holding this one line. In the scenario, we threw in an EMS situation where somebody, and those things happen. Life happens every day. Everything in life happens. So we threw in a scenario where there was a person that was having a cardiac incident near this area where there was a disturbance. So we brought in an ambulance. So this ambulance crew, mistakes on their part, they came in just like it was a regular EMS call. So they pull up in their ice cream truck there, and they park, and they just leave it running and go inside to deal with the cardiac case. So the bad guys, if you will, playing the suspects, I looked at one of them, and I was the controller. I was like, and steal the ambulance. And they're like, we can? I was like, sure. They left it unlocked. So they just get in it, and these National Guard soldiers stare these people down as they walk over, get in this ambulance, and then drive it away. Because that was not their mission. They were never told to stop anybody from doing that. I mean, they literally will do what they are told, and that's it. So they're not independent thinkers. So working with them, it's going to take a minute. Their roles have to be explained very well. They have specific rules of engagement. You have to understand what they're going to do, not do. And they are expensive. You are correct, Spencer. They're going to, you call them out, you might as well just be sitting there going ka-ching, 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 ka-ching the whole time, because it's going to be a real expensive deployment. So we had a lot of learning lessons when we worked with the National Guard and with our fire department. So, most places in the country, I think things are better now than they were way back, but there was a time and place where the fire department wouldn't talk to the police department in some places. I know that to be a fact because I went to Charlottesville twice, so I can say that there's things like that that go on. But we worked with them as well because we needed them. They have things that we needed like ladders, um, bucket trucks, that sort of stuff to get people off of roofs. We had none of that equipment in the police department, but this is a riot situation, so we had to learn how to work with them. What were their parameters? And it was very similar to working with the National Guard. There's got to be conversations ahead of time about what they're willing to do, what they're not willing to do, how they're willing to do it safely, et cetera, et cetera. So we learned through those big exercises, and these were huge exercises we did each year. Um, we learned above all else to talk to the other entities in advance. Rehearsals are a planning concept, if you will, within the tactical world. You've got all your other, pre-movements and op orders and warning orders, but a rehearsal is a key part of the tactical planning process, and that's all that these trainings were they were giant rehearsals, and they were a huge help. Um, some of the other tools, and this bleeds over to the civil disturbance end of it. There's so many different tools available if you are having civil disturbance, but all of them you have to know capabilities and stuff in advance. We had at that time horses. We had mounted patrol, so they were amazing. So we had horses, dogs. You got police line, simple police line tape, bike racks. You got water barricades, fences, chemical munitions, less lethal. You got impact munitions, lots of other stuff available to you. All these tools, but you have to know when they work, when they don't work. The horses were great. The soldiers, when we were doing these live exercises, they learned. They were smart. They evolved just like the real crowds do, just like these real civil disturbance. They will quickly counter any of your actions. So the pepper ball guns and the impact munitions, what do they use right now, today, like current day today? What are they using right now to counter some of that, these protests? Anybody? Anybody know? Anybody seen them? Paid attention to what they use? Real simple thing. It's umbrellas. You see them all the time now. They'll use umbrellas. So it's to block view, but also those will counter a lot of the impact munitions. They're not designed to go all the way break through those. So they'll pop up umbrellas and use those to not only block your view of what they're doing, but also to counteract some of the impact munitions and things like that that the law enforcement may have at their disposal to try to use against the rioters, if you will. The protests nowadays, like I said, I'm a little bit disconnected from this. This was something I did 20 some years ago. The biggest change I have seen between then and now is the social media effects. 20 years ago, that was not as much. If it was the regular news media, some word of mouth stuff, but social media just wasn't there. Now it has a huge influence, and it can grow a crowd very quickly. We had that happen here on campus this past spring, where we had some of the pro-Palestinian protesters. They tried to set up one of the little encampment deals. And finally, after a couple of days, the leadership had said, nope, they're in violation of our policy 5,000 on gatherings. They got to go. And so the police department was going to deal with that. Well, we fall under a legal act. And this is another thing with being a planning section chief and you're going into assist a locality, you may or may not know all of the local ordinances and laws that affect you, especially in higher ed too. Higher ed's kind of crazy. So because of the Clary Act, we were required, because this was a major law enforcement action, we were required to send out a timely warning. So through the email system, we sent out a timely warning saying, heavy police presence at the, near the Squire Student Center, please avoid the area. And within 10 minutes of sending that out, about 600 more students showed up. It was like ringing the dinner bell to bring them all in. And so, now we kind of made our problem worse. Now, for those of you that don't know the Clary Act or don't work in higher ed, It's basically the based off a female student many years ago who was ended up getting raped and murdered at a school because she was not her parent. You know, they had no idea about the crime. I'm giving the very short, basic version of this, guys. Not, you know, don't hold me to the word for word. I'm trying to stay high level, but basically, the claim was they had no idea what the crime was at the campus, et cetera, and left her vulnerable, and this terrible thing ended up happening to her. So it requires universities to be open about their crime stats, but also there's ties in that with warning folks. We personally have a piece of that, Virginia Tech, because of our shootings in 2007. The Department of Education held us liable for not properly warning the campus after the first shootings went out. Not going to go down that road, but you got to warn your campus. You've got to learn all the aspects, but there are some caveats in that. So when we had this protest, they decide they're going to arrest them. We put out the required timely warning. And it had that effect of bringing 600 students to the area. After that, if we'd have had any more issues, we were no longer required to send out that notification, because there is a loophole in that law that says that you have to send out that warning unless it will make things worse. So we now had proof that it would make things worse, so we no longer had to send out any of those timely warnings that we had large police activity. Another aspect of working with law enforcement is, and again, it was my previous career, so I can talk a little bit bad about it, or at least show some of the faults. Where they are very good at is in the operations section and on tactics. Law enforcement is very good there. Where they are very bad at is planning, logistics, finance. All of the support aspects and all of the recovery long-term aspects, that is where law enforcement lacks or tends to lack. And this is not all of law enforcement. This is probably, I would think I'm safe in saying most of law enforcement, and they are improving, but most places, they're really bad at logistics, planning, and finance, but they're very good in operations. So as an IMT supporting them, probably you're going to have less work to do, if you will, on operations, but that planning, logistics, finance, you're going to be pretty heavy on. Our agency here, an example of that, they decided that they were going to go ahead and give these students a million chances, but then they were going to start affecting arrests. They thought that after the first few people actually got stood up, put in handcuffs, put in a car, or drove away, this would make the rest of them second guess their bad choices, maybe, and kind of disperse and go away. And that didn't happen, which is unusual. I would have thought the same thing 15 years ago, but now is a different time. And these were very different protests. Okay. And it goes into knowing the actual protesters, the motivation of the protesters, et cetera, et cetera. So what happened was they started standing these folks up and saying, all right, this is your absolute last chance. You're going to go to jail if you don't go. And they're like, fine, arrest me. Put them in handcuffs, throw them in the car. Do the next person, fine, arrest me. Next person, fine, arrest me. On and on. This went on for almost 4 hours straight. They ended up arresting 86 students, faculty, and staff that were part of this protest, and a few outside influence. I think most of them, 50 to 55, were actual students or members of the campus community, and the rest were outside influencers that were involved. So now your problem is, were you prepared for that level of arrest? And they handled it pretty well, and it was spaced out enough that they did it. But if they'd have done that all at once, they really didn't have a good mass arrest plan. So slowing them down and getting them into a planning process and thinking long term, and especially recovery, demobilization, et cetera, can be challenges that you're faced with. And I would say there's egos and stuff involved with that when you're talking about, whether you're talking about fire service, law enforcement, et cetera. Yeah, you have to tread a little bit lightly coming in. It helps if you have the background or you got a good liaison that's there with you, helping you. But that is where they're strong, as operations. They're not as good in planning. or logistics finance, and they don't do well there. Trying to think of some of the other aspects that I wanted to cover. Does anybody have questions or comments so far? Yeah, go ahead, Michael.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. Just a quick one. Just to clarify, when you had your fire service folks come with you with your National Guard and your police up to that camp or whatever the thing, there was clear delineation as to their roles, right? I mean, I know you mentioned that they have ladders and stuff like that. The first thing I thought of was my fear that Virginia was, going to be doing fire hoses on protesters, but I don't think that's the case in your jurisdiction. But the point being is that it's something that I think everybody we need to make a statement or have a professional conduct, raise your hand kind of a thing about sort of the humanitarian side. And I'm putting my Red Cross hat on, but that perception that this group does this and this group does that when it comes to public safety, it would really ruin a community, and and the lawsuits will come and all that kind of fun stuff. But quickly, I think you could probably do a whole session just on campus civil disturbances after this pro-Palestinian, because your answer and what I saw on the news of a couple of Texas schools, where certain large Texas Rangers, or I don't know who they were, they certainly were not having it the same way the folks up in Columbia in New York had to deal with it. And that is all a matter of the university's perception. I wonder, if you mentioned the crisis communications and doing the system and the alerts. I wonder if it would have been there would have been some benefit to the university, putting out a statement, for example. Okay, if these protests come to our school, please recall that you can have two things: a civil, arrest or whatever it is, and you're subject to university judiciaries. So, and I sat on that board for a couple of years. You can do something like fail to police whatever, name the crime, whatever it is that puts you in handcuffs. But on top of that, you can be expelled immediately or suspended, by the ombudsman, the provost, whatever. A lot of students might be surprised that it's not double jeopardy and that kind of thing. But knowing that in advance, I think some of them might have had a second tune about like that arrest, because when they got to go home and tell mommy, it's one thing to say, oh yeah, my parents were 60s hippies or whatever, this is cool, blah, 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 blah. But it's another thing to say, I'm out of school. I'm done. All my loans are still due though.
Yeah, a couple things. I'll unpack a little bit of that there. So the fire service and their equipment and all that stuff. So great points on that. They don't want to turn their hoses on. Now during this training, we actually did let them turn some hoses on some people just to show them what the power was for like fun stuff, but not for the future. But actually, what we had to do this before this riot training. We actually cross trained with the fire department on their equipment, so we knew how to use their hoses. The reason for that, we actually had an incident where a guy barricaded himself in a house and then ended up dousing the house and himself with gasoline and was threatening. He had a gun in one hand and a lighter in the other. And so at that incident, we had asked our SWAT commander had asked the fire department, hey, we'll kick the door in, you guys blast him with a damn hose so he can't light himself on fire, basically. And they absolutely would not do that. And so we resolved that case with negotiators and some other things. So he didn't light the house on fire, he didn't kill himself, etc. And they didn't have to turn hoses on him. However, after that, our commanders were like, fine, if you're not going to do that, you have equipment we need, you're going to train our folks on it. And they're like, yeah, fine, we'll do that. So we actually all got trained on how to use the fire equipment in case we had something close to that. But we would not use it for riot stuff. That was not an option for riot control, right? But what they did have was the ladders and everything else. So we did have a deep conversation on what was their role. And mainly it was to get access to roofs or high points that we could not reach if we either detained people, took people into custody, or had to put officers in an area. So basically they were like a vertical Uber, if you will, to get us where we needed to go. And that was clear. And we weren't going to be turning fire hoses on people.
Yeah,
But,
and to be clear too, I mean, look at Minneapolis after George Floyd, and even the I used to work in Trenton, New Jersey. They had police cars set on fire. Some of that you've got to put that fire out. Minneapolis lost a police station. I don't even know how many millions of dollars that building was. So there is definitely missions, and they need to be protected. And what happens if they get fired on by protesters? All that kind of, you definitely want them in the conversation. You want them in the unified command.
yep. Yeah. And the more conversations you can have ahead of time, the better. And that's the disadvantage coming in as a planning section on IMT, coming into another area to help them. Cause that's what we do, is you don't know how many of those conversations have taken place ahead of time. So it's just another aspect. As far as the university statements, the university had made several statements, like trying to warn these folks. I think their commitment now to some of these causes is a little bit different. Now, saying that they don't, even though the university is telling them, look, this can affect your school, you can get kicked out. Some of these folks, the younger generation, they don't think about that till it actually hits. So then after they're arrested, then that's when they start panicking. No matter if you've told them 6 times, hey, this can affect you academically, criminally, whatever. They don't care. They don't listen until they're actually sitting there in handcuffs in the court system. Then they're in a panic. So we tried. The other complicated politics we had that's worth noting is our county, the county that we reside in, our university, the local Commonwealth attorney decided they did not want to prosecute any of these cases, because I think they arrested them for trespassing or something. Like it was a misdemeanor, like trespassing charge or something that they used on them. So the local Commonwealth attorney was like, nope, I'm not prosecuting any of these. So we actually contacted the state attorney general, and this attorney general for the Commonwealth of Virginia said, oh no, I will come in and personally prosecute them, and came down and was going to prosecute, attorneys from his office at the state level. And they can do that in Virginia. If the local Commonwealth attorney decides they don't want to mess with something, the attorney general's office can step in and do it because it's a state charge. So there were some complications there, but those people got student conduct and criminal charges, and it's still kind of messed up in the court system. But on the good part, after that night of arrests, we haven't had any more encampment style protests or anything like that anymore. So I think it had the desired effect because it stopped it.
Yeah, I know Columbia is dealing with a whole, process now of, checking IDs, getting people onto campus. It is, become a tighter ship. Their president resigned. There's a lot of, it's really unfortunate. And what really makes me mad about the Columbia thing is they have a national disaster institute or something like that. They have people that are emergency management professors training the next generation of emergency management folks, and they can't even manage an emergency on their own campus. So, that, or they're doing it purposely against the lipper, right? They're not looking at life safety. That's what drives me the craziest. You can't talk the talk and not walk the walk.
And we, our office got involved with those campus protests, the emergency management office. Again, law enforcement's not good. So to summarize my whole talk, and I know it was a little bit discombobulated here, but law enforcement is very good in operations and tactics, but not good in the support stuff. They're independent thinkers in general. This is a general statement. It's not a specific statement or blanket across all agencies, but they very much, you have to understand, they have a mindset of individual thought process, decision making, et cetera. So when you bring them together as a team, sometimes there's struggles, right? And the other big thing that I'm trying to get jumping around from the fire department, National Guard, et cetera, is it is so critical to work with those other partners ahead of time in training. We'll call it a rehearsal for these incidents. So when you go into help as a planning section chief, you've got to very quickly evaluate where they are with all that stuff. You got to figure out if they've worked that out. And if you have not, sometimes you become as a part of the planning process, you've got to on the fly try to work out some of these really complicated things we just talked about that could happen if they have not already discussed that. And then there's a high likelihood they may not have covered every single base that you could possibly run into. Does that make sense? I hope. All right. If there's any other questions, great. Otherwise, Spencer, I know we're past 5. I didn't want to keep going on and on. Again, explaining the general idea of law enforcement and that working with others and high level stuff. We could probably have a lot deeper conversations on several little spinoff topics of this, the campus protests or current event protests, that sort of thing. But that's all I really got.
No, Chris, that's perfect. You had a lot of good notes there. I grabbed some for me personally to take back on our stuff as we're looking at elections and possible civil unrest. And one of those, I'm blessed and thankful we live out west where there's about 12 folks that show up to anything, not in the big cities like some of you guys where you get real stuff on the civil. So cool. Any other thoughts or questions for Chris or any other good of the orders? Okay, hearing none, we'll be back in October. Real fast, got an email from Mike as he was departing that he's going to reschedule it to November. So if anyone has any good ideas for October, let me know, and we'll reach out and do some poking around and whatnot. So with that, have a great day, and we'll talk to y'all down the road.
Take care, everybody. We'll see you.
Take care. Thanks, guys.